Hello, I'm Geoff Johns. Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV.
Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and today my extra special guest is a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. It is the one and only Geoff Johns. How are you, mate?
Hey, how are you doing? Great to
I'm
see
good. Yeah,
you.
great to see you again, mate. You're looking very well.
Thanks, you too.
Yeah, that Burbank life is agreeing with you.
It's nice. The weather's very nice out here.
Yeah, you really can't argue with that weather.
It's hard. That's the one thing you can argue about. Everything else, traffic, everything else you can argue about, but the weather's undeniable.
Oh, there's no doubt. I've always been a big fan of Burbank, and in the normal course of things, certainly pre-pandemic, for Titan, I'd have to work in LA and specifically at Burbank several times a year. And in the end, after years of like staying in different neighborhoods in Los Angeles, I ended up staying in Pasadena, which I really quite like. And you can walk around on foot, and it's only about 20 minutes drive from Burbank, so it seemed like.
Pasadena is a great area. It's interesting because it's got such a history to it. Well, for the States, it's got such a history to it there.
Well, Geoff, that's exactly what I responded to about it, because that's it. You know, being English, I like a bit of history, and but I also like neighborhoods that I can get around on foot. And for me, one of the big issues with LA is you pretty much got to drive everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yes, everywhere. Yeah.
With those phenomenal distances between, not distances, but the time spent between neighborhoods that are on the map are very close to anywhere else in the world. It'd be a 5-minute drive, and yet you're in the car for 90 minutes.
Yeah, you can be. Yeah, I mean, I don't tend to. Definitely, like the average, if I'm driving over the hill or whatever, it's usually about 30 to 45 minutes.
Where are you from originally, Geoff?
Detroit, Michigan.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know well.
Grew up there. Yeah. So I was there. Then I went to Michigan State University, which is about an hour from where I grew up, and then moved out to Los Angeles immediately after I graduated. So,
yeah. What was your first exposure to comic books?
My grandmother's attic. So growing up, there's a big Lebanese community in Dearborn. It's the biggest in the States. And my father's Lebanese, so my family's from that area in Dearborn. And my grandparents lived in a very small house with an attic. And my grandfather was actually, he was sick. He was schizophrenic, and he was drugged up a lot. Back then, drugs just kind of numbed him. And so he would kind of sit in his chair and hand us dollar bills. And he was very kind, but he was out of it. And so it was, for my brother and I, it was sometimes a place where you'd go and you just didn't know quite what to do there. And we would end up, eventually my grandmother would say, why don't you guys go in the attic, and there's toys and everything else, and we go there. And so when we spent time there, we would end up in the attic, and we found this old box of comic books that belonged to my uncle, and they were all from the 60s. And so it was Flash and Lois Lane and Superman and Batman and Fantastic Four and Daredevil and Metamorphos. And I have a real love for Metamorpho, only because growing up I thought he was just like all the other characters. He was like one of the main. He has his own book, so of course he was a big character. So I grew up with that kind of like checkerboard area. I love the checkerboard, which is why I have the checkerboard on.
That's why you put it on your books. Yeah,
on Geiger and Joe, because it always, whenever I saw a checkerboard on the book, I was like, I knew it was good. Like, it was a good story. It was an interesting story. And so that checkerboard on DC, those go-go checks just meant something to me. And and I thought, well, for me, it's almost was when I did Geiger with Gary and Junkyard Joe, putting those checkerboard, those go-go checks on the top was me going back to like that feeling of when I would find the comics, and my brother and I would discover these characters. But it was really mostly DC. There was some Marvel too, but it was really, that's my first exposure to comic books. And we would read those things backwards and forwards, and they were all from like probably the mid 60s. Maybe there were some older, not many newer. And then I remember going to a drugstore and seeing a Justice League of America comic and realizing, oh my gosh, they make comics still. Like, I thought they were just old. And then the first comic book I bought was Batman and the Outsiders number 13 off the stands. And it was a great issue, Mike Barr's story about Bruce Wayne was poisoned, and it was such a good story. I'm surprised people don't talk more about it because it was so poignant. But it was the first time the Outsiders, so Batman had gathered these kind of outcast superheroes, and Metamorpho was in there. That's why I bought it, right? Because I'm like, oh my gosh, Batman and Metamorpho, I'd known them. And then there was Black Lightning and Katana and Halo, all characters I just love. But and they're so interesting. But the story was about Batman was poisoned, and Alfred had to get the Outsiders to somehow recreate his origin and keep him alive through the night for this antidote to work, something like that. And so the Outsiders, for the very first time, learned that Batman was Bruce Wayne, and learned that, oh my God, this is why he does it. His parents were murdered in front of him. And so it was such a cool, emotional story about these people realizing that I'll never forget, I think Halo says that poor man. Like, the fact that they have sympathy for Batman in that, and they discover this thing. I just thought it was so interesting to me, because I'm like, of course you would not know why Batman does it. And then when you would learn, you'd be like, oh my God, that's horrible. And so that was the moment I read that new, because other comics were fun, but the moment I read that comic and it had that emotional kind of center to it, that was it for me. I was in.
That's a very powerful story to be immersed in. I think I really loved that era of Batman and the Outsiders. I think one of the things is that for me, Jim Aparo is like my favorite Batman artist, but not only that, he's one of my favorite cross spectrum DC artists, because I think he's the reason why he's so perfectly suited for Brave and the Bold is his version of everybody looks great. You know what I mean? And his male characters have this kind of hyper masculinity to them without it being overblown. Like, his Bruce Wayne looks just this hyper masculine kind of 1950s archetype person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the Outsiders was so lucky to have Jim's work, and then Alan Davis came on, and so you had these great artists. So the Outsiders were, it was just I thought it was a great run, great characters, all new. I'm not quite sure why they just collected it in trade and hardcovers finally, and that last one was so hard to find. Like, I had to buy it off eBay for like $100. It was so hard to find. Like, they must have barely printed any of them, because I couldn't find it anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's so strong. I mean, I too have my memories of the checkerboards, which are, I think the checkerboard issues are hugely emotionally evocative for a whole generation of people.
Yeah.
And I think I think it's a checkerboard cover. One of the covers that really stuck in my mind, I can remember holding it in my hands and reading it on holiday in Wales when I was a kid, is I think it's an issue of Detective, it might be Batman, but it's the house the Joker built.
That
is such a brilliant cover.
It's such a great cover. Arresting. Those covers, you wanted to read the stories. They weren't pinups.
Yeah,
right. So often today they're like, I get it, they're movie posters, they're pinups, they're beautiful, but back then they drew you in. I loved, my favorites back then to read were Superman, Lois Lane, and Jimmy Olsen, because the covers were so crazy. And as a kid, I was like, he had a stack of these, and like, I still to this day love reading those Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen comics, because they're just so nuts. Like, they're also the first time where Superman was a character that was so well known, you could start to tell stories that were a little more meta. Right. They were a little bit more like taking Superman and turning it and changing it. And what if this happened and that happened? What if Bruce Wayne married Lois Lane? Like, had all these crazy stories. And it was the first time that the audience was savvy enough and knew enough about Superman, because of all the history behind him, that you could do that kind of stuff. Now they do it all the time, right? They can do new Spider-Man movie with 3 Spider-Mans, and they can kind of be meta about all that stuff. But back then, like, the first kind of meta comics were like Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen's.
I think that's very well observed, and it's the weird sort of almost hyper emotionality of those covers, because there would
Mhm.
often be these kind of, you know, the love triangle covers they would often have, or the betrayal covers be like, you know,
Yeah,
Superman
right.
would being cruel to either Lois or Jimmy.
Yeah,
You're not my friend anymore, Jimmy. Now my best friend is Robin, or whatever. You know, all of
yeah,
that.
yeah. Or Jimmy. I mean, he became powerful 10 times.
Yeah.
A year he would have new powers and
Right.
develop.
Oh, yeah.
It was
Yeah.
cool.
No, no, for sure. Um, Geoff, let's segue from talking about like deep comic classics, which I know you and I could talk about for hours,
Yeah,
but I want to talk about some of the epic stuff you're working on at the moment. Now,
sure.
specifically, your latest addition to the Geiger universe that you created, which is a fascinating enterprise within itself. But your new Geiger book is Junkyard Joe.
Yeah,
So, what can you tell me about it, and how did it come to be?
sure. I mean, it really came from Gary Frank and I have worked together for I don't know, 15 years, a long time, over
So,
15 years
so
now.
successfully as well. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's an amazing partnership to have.
yeah. I mean, some of my closest friends in the world, obviously, and we've collaborated so much and on starting on. I mean, we started on Avengers way back when. I was a huge fan of his Hulk run, and we met on Avengers on a single issue, and I just always wanted to keep working with him because I love his art. It's so emotional, it's so detailed, and kind of there's this classic style to it that resonates with me in a huge way. And so ultimately we started on Superman and the Legion of Superheroes. And then we did Superman Brainiac, Superman Secret Origin, Batman Earth One. We did 3 volumes of that, Shazam and Doomsday Clock. And then and after that, we had, Gary's a classic artist. He's not a fanboy. He just loves to create stories and
Yeah,
characters and art. And once we did Doomsday Clock, it was like, okay, what do we want to do? And it was really, we want to do our own thing. We want to do our own characters and also things that are genre, but not really straight superheroes, just because we've done it. We want to tell different stories. I love superheroes. It's not all I care about. And same with Gary. So we set out and I had this idea where we would tell kind of like, I'd always loved the legend of like Paul Bunyan and John Henry, these kind of American mythic like they were basically superheroes, American myths that existed and had these tall tales. I used to love reading about these larger than life characters that maybe they were real, maybe they weren't, like they were based on real people or not. And so the idea was, well, rather than kind of like looking at history, like telling these stories of characters that existed in different times, and they all exist in the same timeline, but we started at the very end with the future with Geiger, and it came from originally that also emotionally came from, I think Gary and I are both fathers, so what the lengths you would kind of go to protect your children, your family. And it was, you know for me, it sparked something off that was very primal. Like, you do anything, and in this day and age, it's very scary out there, right? For
yeah,
somebody, the world is frightening. Someone said to me, I don't know if I'm going to encourage my kids to have kids. For someone to say that is frightening, right? And so in a world where you're trying to protect your family, and how do you protect your family, and you'll do anything, you have faith, and everything else is heightening that world and exploring that notion and giving him these radioactive powers, and which kind of represent his sorrow, grief, and rage all at once. And Geiger was created, and then through that we started to talk about Junkyard Joe, and actually introduced him at the end of Geiger, but always knew that for Junkyard Joe, the story I wanted to tell was one of a veteran, and both with this veteran, that this soldier that Joe the robot encounters in Vietnam in 1972. And then, the first issue is all in Vietnam. It's 1972. And it's about the junkyard dogs, this group of soldiers that get together, and they've lost people, and they gain one more who they don't know, and ultimately discover it's this robotic soldier from who knows where, there to do who knows what, but it's protecting them. standing guard, it's taking out enemies, it's there, it bonds with them, it plays cards with them, it starts to become one of them. And then by the end of the first issue, there's only one soldier that survives thanks to Joe. But when he wakes up in the hospital on his way back home, or about to go back home, the doctor tells him, like, you need to stop, whatever you saw out there, it wasn't what you think. Like, you need to stop talking about a robot soldier, otherwise you're going to get a blue wristband, and you don't want a blue wristband because you're not going to go home the way you think you are. And so he convinced himself that maybe it was just something he saw. The soldier, Muddy, then in issue 2, we pick up today, and he's in his 70s now. And what we come to learn is he came back, he's a cartoonist, and he's drawn this Junkyard Joe comic book strip for 50 years. And he is, and he's just retiring from it. And so he took this idea he had, this vision, and called it Junkyard Joe. And it's this kind of Beetle Bailey, Peanuts like strip that became really famous. And there was cartoon specials and merchandise, and every Sunday it was in the funnies. And we see the strip in there. And it's all about this veteran, this old man, this cartoonist, and this really emotional point in his life. And one night where he's just lost his wife, and one night on the porch, he hears something, and he opens the door, and there's Junkyard Joe. And the story continues from there. But issue 1 is, it could be read as a war comic, or as or as just a sci-fi comic or an adventure comic. But issue 2 really is where the story goes off in a completely different direction. Issue 1's almost like a prologue, and issue 2 on is today, and it's the bulk of the story. It is the story. And Joe's, in a lot of ways, is a metaphor or a symbol for veterans who come home and don't know what to do next. And Joe is that. And the story of who he is, where he's from, what he's doing, and how he affects the lives of those he intersects with, including Muddy and some other people, in the series that we introduced in issue 2. That's what it's all about. It's about finding a place. It's about brotherhood, sacrifice. It's loss. It's a real personal story, and a real, I think, important story. And again, Gary and I, every time I've worked with Gary, we always try and create a story that we can give anybody. And we've looked at our trades of our stories that have collected it, and you're like, you could hand any of these to anybody. You don't need to read anything. And to me, working so much in continuity, DC's continuity, it's fun, and I love it. But at the same time, you've got to already be reading the comics to really read. You can read Sinestro Corps, but you're not. It's going to be a little confusing with the backstory. And if you're not a hardcore comic reader, with Gary and I, we've always, I don't know why, we've always kind of leaned more towards the stories that you could hand anybody, like whether it's Shazam or Secret Origin or Batman Earth One. You can even Superman, Legion of Superheroes. You don't need to know anything about the Legion. I also grew up on Adventure Comics, so those checkerboard. That's why I love the Legion too.
Right.
But anyway, that's where it came from. That's what the story is about. And the first issue's out. It got a great response. We're really grateful for that. And we just went to a second printing, which is cool. And I feel like we're just starting to get the Geiger universe, like this world of characters. We're being very methodical about how we introduce them, and making sure that they're all, each story we tell, and they're all going to intersect at some point, but each story we tell is the best story we can deliver, because these characters they're our characters. We really value them, and we really want to treat them carefully. And I think one of the things Gary and I, the reason we did this is to create new, and to also have a creative control over it, so that there's a beginning, middle, and an end. Like,
of course.
No matter how much fun I had on Green Lantern, I could never write a proper ending, because it was always going to keep going. So I could only write an ending for that run and that story, which is totally fine. That's what you do on these books. But and these characters will live on too in their own ways. But to be able to know the finality of where stories end and how they connect and everything, and have complete creative control, that's really what we wanted to do.
I think that's evident when you read issue 1 of Junkyard Joe. What I personally responded to is the fact that it felt like a very personal story to me. You know, you guys, obviously, your creative chemistry is fantastic, and Gary's a superlative artist. But it's everything that you said in terms of the personal nature of it. But at the same time, you're also playing around with these classic comic archetypes, these classic military, World War II comic book archetypes, which I just think it works beautifully well. And from what you were telling me about issue 2, the fact that you then segue into featuring the life of a veteran cartoonist, of which there were so many. Again, it's such an interesting archetype to play around with, I think.
Yeah, well, no one's ever done it, right? No one's ever had a main character that's a 70-something cartoonist that's a
Yeah.
veteran. I just think that is, and it does harken back to a lot of the artists that I love who were veterans too. But yeah, it's, I'm really excited about the story because I do think it's unique, it's different. And it's such a joy to work in a story that's rooted in such emotion. It's really grounded because we go from the jungles of Vietnam to the winter in a small town in Indiana. And that's where we stay for the rest, well, for the majority of the rest of the story. That's where we are.
Mate, it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic you're getting the chance to do it and to explore those things. As we were talking about off camera, I was introduced to comic books by my grandfather, who's a World War II veteran. So it's very meaningful for me reading issue 1. And that, as to that point, there is something really, I think, interesting and laudable that you're doing with the veteran aspect of the book. Can you just talk about that a bit, please, mate?
Yeah, sure. It was like, if we're gonna tell the stories, I think, like, Gary and I, again, controlling everything about the comic, we can do whatever we want because it's our property, and Image has been so supportive on supporting, our creative desires and also like what we want to do with the book. And so we decided to, I was like, I really want to not just tell stories, but let's help veterans too. And so we published a black and white edition of the comic, and all the proceeds were going to go to 2 charities: the National Coalition for Homeless Vets in the US, and Veterans Aid in the UK. Gary's from the UK, lives in Italy, but he's from the UK. And so it was really important for him. Both like my grandfather on my mother's side and his grandparents served in World War II. And, I never got to meet my grandfather. So my mom would tell me stories about him, and I thought it would be really great to remember him in a way. And so my mom even wrote a thing about him. The story of how he met my grandmother, it kind of inspires a lot of Muddy's story, and his wife. But we raised money. We raised a lot of money too. It's still coming in, but we raised a lot of money and hopefully awareness to these great organizations and worked with them. And it was really humbling and inspiring to do it. And the response has been so great. And I think it gives an emotionality to the story, because once you read that story and then you read all these dedications to people from the creative team, like Brian Cunningham's, like, they're all so well written. And you can just feel the emotion in them. And then you can then to talk about the charities and what the readers are actually doing, because not only are we giving all the proceeds of the black and white books to the charities, but also, Matt Ghost is giving $2 a book to the charities too. So that whole cover price, almost that entire cover price, is going to the charity directly. So it's great to have, everyone's paying money for these books, and it's expensive to buy a comic now, but to have all that money go directly to the charities, it's pretty special. That we could do that is great.
I mean, I think you're doing something that I've not seen anybody within the comics business do before for military veterans.
Mhm.
And I think one of the reasons it's important, and it moved me, I've got that military dimension to the way I got into comic books and what they mean to me. But as an observer, as somebody who is related to a bunch of people who had military service, I think what's truly interesting is the relationship between military duty and comic books, because of course they're kind of inextricably linked. And soldiers have been entertained by comic books for the better part of a century,
Yeah.
and have fueled for decades comic book entertainment the other way around. So, you know, the rich history of DC and Marvel war books, you know, whether it's Sergeant Rock, whether it's Fury, and, you know, creators like, you know, like Joe Kubert and, you know, and Kanigher didn't see any service, which I remember being amazed by when I found that out. But those books are just, it's such a close hand-in-hand relationship that I think to recognize that by doing something for the people who've inspired this entertainment and who have been so entertained by this art form, I think is something I've not seen anybody do before, mate.
Well, I mean, we're glad to do it. That's all. Like,
Yeah.
again, we're just glad to do it. And you know, I've over the years have met so many people in the service that read the books and are excited to read the books. And,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
it's our privilege to be able to do something, really.
Yeah, it is a brilliant initiative, and it's a fascinating book. And anybody watching our conversation here, you can order Junkyard Joe issue 1, and you can pre-order issues 2 onwards from the links attached to our conversation. And again, for me, it's a classic example of a book that's superlative entertainment, but it's also achieving something important. And I think, you know, when you manage to come up with an initiative that achieves those things, that's a great confluence of factors, I think.
Yeah.
To talk about, I guess, the era that many people associate, even to this day, military service with, which is the classic era of World War II, the Greatest Generation. That's really the crucible of the creative crucible of many things that you've been closely identified with throughout your creative life. And I'm thinking specifically about the Golden Age DC
Right.
heroes and your relationship with the JSA. Yeah, which there are 2 ways into this conversation with me, because I love the JSA, always have. I love your work on the JSA particularly, and that stuff that you did 20 years ago, you know, with the original JSA lineup and stuff with James Robinson and Sand and all that. I absolutely can't tell you how much I loved those books at the time, mate.
Good, thanks.
And the fact that you sustained that link to the Sandman Mystery Theatre, there's a through line into the JSA. I thought it was wonderful.
Thanks.
But so I could fanboy out, and I could ask you half an hour of questions about that.
I could talk about it for half an hour easily.
And I think we will get into some of it, but I'd like to begin by talking about the new Justice Society of America book. How did that come to be, and what is the focus?
Sure. You know, it's interesting. I've written a lot of characters over the years that I love. The Flash, you know, the Teen Titan, Superman, Aquaman. There's Green Lantern, of course. But really, there's kind of 2 groups of characters. There's two characters that I don't think I like. It'd be very difficult for me to go back to a lot of comics I've ever already written at this point, characters, because I feel like I've told the stories I want to tell. There's kind of 2. There's a group and a character that probably that superseded Superman, for one, because I could write Superman forever. I think he's an amazing character, and there's something about him when he's at the center of a story, like Doomsday Clock or the Superman books I've done. I love Superman. I can't get enough. Like, that character to me is the greatest superhero character ever created. And then there's a JSA, and the JSA, I just find that world and the history of the characters from the Golden Age on up to the far future, like that they have such a tapestry to play across. Their stories have such a tapestry, but I like that they feel a little more grounded than the Justice League, right? Their stories are mostly, you know, here, and the characters are the more kind of, to me, relatable, but they're also more unexplored. There's so many corners to go to and characters to choose from and boxes to open up and discover, that for me, the JSA is just, it's an endless kind of labyrinth of fun and adventure to look at. And so it really came from, like, I love telling stories about the JSA. I've been working on Stargirl for these last 3 seasons, and telling the JSA through a TV show. You know, I moved to, when we shoot, I live in Atlanta. I'm there every day on set, and for 6 months out of the year, the last 3 years. And it really is a passion for me to do that show for a lot of reasons. Obviously, Stargirl is really special to me, but also exploring the JSA through that and keeping the DNA of it. It's a very different take on the JSA, but the DNA of it's the same. The emotionality of it is the same. That's important to me. But the JSA, for some reason, it always feels like just a never ending, I don't know, place to have fun. That being said, like, there hadn't been a JSA book for a long time, and I wanted to, I was working on a Stargirl book already with Todd Knock, and it tied into some other stuff, and JSA kind of came up, and we had been talking about JSA for a while, and then the stars kind of aligned with Mikel Janin, and I had a story that connected all this stuff together that was about expanding the golden age and expanding the present day JSA at the same time. So so really it was it was really a opportunity to just go back and get into these characters I love, and Stargirl, who I love, and the JSA, who I love, but also what we'll come to see in the new golden age. And we hinted at the end of Flashpoint is not only expanding it today, but also expanding it yesterday and going back into the golden age. Roy Thomas did it all the time, where he introduced new characters like Amazing Man.
Yeah.
And I love that, because it introduced a whole new avenue to go down in the golden age, so that when we're telling stories about the past, they're not stagnant. They don't just stay there. So by introducing a whole new wave of characters that existed back then, some minor and some more major, it's going to give us an opportunity to tell stories about the past that are new, and introduce characters you don't know but existed, and hopefully they'll feel like they always existed. And at the same time, that'll tie into and affect today's stories, because legacy continues through history. So it just became a bigger idea, and a really exciting idea, to explore a JSA book that doesn't just deal with today, but also yesterday and tomorrow. So
Yeah.
it's much bigger in scope, but it's still going to be grounded and focused on character and emotion. And the main character in it is Helena Wayne, who I'm excited to bring back, this version of her at least. And that, I'm excited for. I don't think people quite know what they're in for JSA 1. It's very, very different, but I think at the same time they're going to hopefully enjoy it. If you're a JSA fan, I think you will.
Yeah.
And the art's just, the
That's
art
what
is
was that's who's the artist on the book, mate?
Mikel Janin.
Yeah.
It's just gorgeous.
What I always think when I read your work about the JSA is that I think what you share with Roy Thomas is the absolute joy that you have writing those characters, and that leaps off the page. I mean, I remember back when he was doing Young All Stars, there's a moment, and I guess he planned it from moment one. He must have done, thinking about it, that he ties in the lineage of Iron Monroe into Philip Wiley's Gladiator. Yeah, and Hugo Danner. I can't begin to tell you how excited I was when I read that.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, and the cool thing I love, like his Infinity Inc. work too. The thing I love is that there's two levels of the story. There's a level where it's just a good emotional story of these characters up top. But if you know the stuff, there's a deeper level of storytelling that's happening at the same time for those who really know it. But he always managed to kind of balance both, but the writer who made me fall in love with them in such a deep way was James. And James did that with JSA, the Golden Age. I always loved the JSA. I love that run right before 0 Hour. It was wonderful. The miniseries Tom Lyle did. Like, I remember just anytime the JSA had a story, I love reading about them, because I'm like, who are these characters? They've been around forever, but they're so unknown. But when James came on and did JSA, the Golden Age, that blew my mind. It was such a beautiful book. But more importantly, every single character, he would take these minor characters, and every single one had a huge story, an emotional story. And to me, it was it meant a lot. And that, followed by Starman, is what permanently sucked me in, right? That did. That's I mean, that's why I launched Stars and Stripe, because I love the Golden Age. I love, for me, back when I was reading comics, before I got into them, my two favorite books were Starman and Superboy. And I loved what James was doing on Starman, and I love what Carl and Tom Grummett were doing on
Yeah.
Superboy, because it was so fun. The DC had all these cool, fun young books back
Yeah.
then, right? Like with young heroes, and Superboy was my favorite. And so when I did Stars and Stripe, it was kind of taking my love for the golden age and also for these young heroes of that day with Young Justice, and launching Stars and Stripe, which brings me full circle, because now I'm launching the Stargirl event series called The Lost Children with Todd Knock,
Right on.
who influenced me heavily on Stargirl, creating of Stargirl and Stripe. So it's for me, it does feel full circle. And after, you know, I'd spent all this time on the show, I'm like, I really do want to write. I want to get a comic book out, because people would ask me, where can I buy a Stargirl comic book for my kid? And I'm like, you can buy the old trade, which is really old. And I did a one shot, and that just didn't feel like enough. There still needed to be a trade. So that's why really I wanted to explore like the teenage universe of Golden Age characters with Stargirl at the center, and expanding that out with that miniseries, and then doing the adults with the JSA. And that's really how I divided it. You kind of have the young all-star squadron right in one, and then, you know, the JSA in the other.
This is an aspect of your work that I really respond to and enjoy, which is your interest in superhero dynasties. And you've mentioned the superhero dynasties, I guess you'd say, in the US. So the first person I was really aware of, Wade did a lot of that stuff really well in Flash before your run. But the first person I thought was really super invested in it was James Robinson, Starman. How it's three generations of Starman at the same time, you know, and not retrospectively either, all involved in the narrative. I too am a huge fan of that run, but I love the way that it's organically fed into what has become this huge kind of organic classicist spine of the DC universe that you've looked after for almost 20 years or so now. You know, what's that ride felt like for you?
It's fun. I mean, it's great. I feel very honored and privileged I've gotten to do it as much as I have, and to kind of again come full circle with Stargirl now is a blessing. To me, DC, like again, DC, there's a type of DC writer that like loves and breathes DC. Mark Waid is 100% one of those writers. He is heart and soul to me. I know he writes a bunch of other stuff and it's all great, but he also, when he's on DC stuff, there's just something magical about everything he does. Grant Morrison's the same way, right? Grant loves, I just can feel the love he has for DC, from his Animal Man run to All-Star Superman. Everything he's done is, for me, there's a heartbeat in there, that, and a love for it, and a understanding of it, and a talent that goes with that to help it, you know, become so much bigger than it is. That and James is the same way. Those are really the three writers that inspire me the most. John Ostrander also does too. I think he's one of the unsung heroes of DC.
Completely agree.
You know, he Suicide Squad's great. I love that book. But Spectre, so amazing. His Firestorm run. There's so many great runs that John did that they should collect all those. Like, I don't know, like they should collect all of them. You also have Marv Wolfman, who was this really, he kind of pioneered a lot of stuff too with Titans. He and George, and so there's all these great writers that have influenced me. Dan Jurgens too. There's so many great writers that have influenced me. But to be able to be there and do some adventures with these characters, and introduce characters that coexist, and just keep the JSA alive, like just keep them alive, because there's these just long periods where the characters get forgotten, you know. I remember when we launched the book in, that's how old I am now, 99, the book launched, and I took over with, I came on actually issue 4 uncredited early on, before it even came out. But people thought the book would last a year. They're like, JSA, no one's going to read JSA. No one's going to read JSA. And because it's been so long since All-Star Squadron and Infinity Inc. and JSA had not had a book since that one prior to Zero Hour. So it's been about 5 years. But there have been just stretches of DC publications where they didn't have a book. And And it's been a while now. They had kind of an Earth 2 book, but they haven't had this book where it stretches back to the 40s. After the New 52, there was a real concentrated effort that people didn't want to have that history.
Yeah.
There. And I think bringing that history back, because it is what it is. It's just that's what JSA is. Like, you can't erase it. Don't erase it. Embrace it. So yeah, it's been just a privilege to do it. And I'll do it for as long as I do it. Then I hope people continue it. I just want to see these characters continue on.
And that's wonderful to hear. Can we just do a few deep character dives on JSA? I tell you a character I thought you
Sure.
always loved your handling of, and I think you really brought into his own, was Johnny Thunder.
Oh, I love
So
yeah.
so I mean, I thought it was a revelation when you first really focused on him and what you did with him. Where did that all come from?
Well, probably, I mean, honestly, so much of my stuff probably got sparked by James Robinson's work again on the Golden Age.
Yeah.
There's one panel about Johnny Thunder after that whole thing went down with. I don't want to spoil JSA Golden Age for anyone who hasn't read it, but you can read it if you haven't. They should collect that in a hardcover. I don't know what, like, just keep getting that book out. That book's such a classic. They need to push that book out more. But there's a panel at the end after everything's over, and Johnny Thunder, even after all that, hasn't learned his lesson. It's kind of a mess up. And I just love that idea of somebody that was, and I played with it in the Stargirl TV show too, to even a greater extent, when Joaquin Thunder was introduced, and the Thunderbolt talks to Pat Dugan and says, he's like, why'd you pick, because he picks Mike first, Mike Dugan, the Thunderbolt does, and he goes, Pat says, why'd you pick Mike out of everybody? Why Mike? Why is Mike your Aladdin? And Thunderbolt says, how it works, like, I can only pick somebody who feels as lonely as I do. And for me, that crystallized who the Thunderbolt was and who Johnny was and who anyone that connects with him was. And I love that Johnny, he's so insecure, and I feel so bad for him, and he messes up all the time, but I feel like his heart's so big. And when a character is like that, I can't help but admire them and want to follow them. And he tries, and I love, his heart breaks. Like, one of my favorite moments is in Doomsday Clock, when he's kind of broken, and then he's reminded, no, like, the Thunderbolt is here, and here it is, and you are part of it. And there's a joy to, I think, Johnny Thunder. I love unleashing all the time with Jakeem and the Thunderbolt. I love finding that strength. There's this season in Stargirl, there's actually a big Jakeem Thunder moment with the Thunderbolt that happens toward the end, and it kind of encapsulates that same thing of just like, they will have their day, right? Johnny Thunder will have his day, but it's not often. And so when it happens, it means a lot more. Yeah. And I just love that character. Like all the JSA characters, again, they feel like their feet are on the ground much more than the Justice League. Much, much more to me. Yeah. They feel much more relatable. They put on hoods, and you can tell they sewed them, together. Whereas the other ones have like these plastic costumes. I just feel like, there's something tactile about the JSA that feels more real, relatable, grounded, rough, and that they have to try harder, right? They struggle. Even Alan Scott and Jake Garrick, who I find kind of the two, like, they're like, to me, the JSA always has to have those two, like, always has to have, like, Jay and Alan, to me, they have to be in the JSA. They're, without them, the JSA just feels like it's missing something. It's just missing, like, the two, like the Batman and Superman of the group or something. I don't know why. In my head, whenever they're not around, it just feels wrong to me.
And I think that is the analogy, the Batman and Superman of the group. I as a reader, I completely agree. What's your feelings on Wildcat?
Oh, that Ted Grant.
Yeah, Ted Grant.
Love Ted Grant. He was actually the triumvirate, the trio. Those three were the three main ones I thought you always had to have in the run I did prior to this. I guess by working with Yolanda, like, I always wanted to work with Yolanda Montez, the Wildcat, because when I was reading comics, she was introduced, and I thought she looked so cool. Yeah. And I love the character. And she's actually on a cover sketch, or a cover of that Alex Ross did for JSA, Just Side of America #1, that we launched in, when was that? 2000, I don't know when we launched that book, 2006, but we had a, maybe it was later, but we had he does this beautiful sketch where it's all of them are on the table, and where Ted Grant was, we had Yolanda Montez Wildcat instead, because I was going to use her in that, and then ultimately didn't. And they killed the character prior, but I always wanted to use her. So when I did the Stargirl TV show, I was like, this is my chance. I'm going to do Yolanda Montez Wildcat. And so I introduced her. I really love writing her. And then I thought it would be, for me, it would be really interesting to pull her into the comics and bring her back and have her be a character, because she didn't really get a chance to be explored, you know, and I think she's an interesting character and deserves to be. So I love Ted Grant. He's trained half the DCU, I think. But
I think that element of Ted Grant, you know, training the heroes in the DCU is a lovely narrative development over the last 20 years or so.
It is great, and him being a big fighter that people knew.
Yeah.
I also think the JSAs, it's imperative that it's all about the generations teaching the next generations.
Yeah.
No, that is just what it should be, and you need that coaching. Otherwise, the JSA is just a group of superheroes. It's got to be about the different generations coming together to work together. That's why I brought Ma Hunkel in. I'm like, I want someone who way past.
So
I love that story. It's that one issue. That's one of my favorite issues that we got to work on. Leonard Kirk drew it, beautiful issue, but where we brought Ma Hunkel back into the fold and just made her the museum curator, but she was also kind of the mother. She's helping everybody. And the story always chokes me up when I read it, actually, because it's such a wonderfully sweet Christmas story. But like, even bringing characters in that aren't superheroes anymore, that are long past retired, physically not unable to be superheroes or uninterested in it, and having them be part of the JSA too, that just, it gives it texture that no other superhero team has, you know. And I think that there's something mass appealing to me about the JSA, that it is all the different generations, the history, the you know, the endless list of characters you can bring in, the new characters you can create because of the legacies. Like, there's something magical about it, and they can be sons and daughters, or they can be people who, like Michael Holt, who picked up the Manowar inspired by, like, I love, or Courtney Whitmore's the same way, Jakeem Thunder's the same way. I love that they don't have to be blood. One of the things I didn't like was that everyone was related. Like, I don't like. I like that it's a mix, right? It's different. And you know, that, I don't know, that's just appealing to me.
That really speaks to me also. It's funny because prior to yourself, one of the I think the only other time that I always loved Wildcat as a concept and as a design, always loved it, and I loved my first exposure was the original Secret Origins reprint of his origin, you know, and that was great. But the treatment of him that I really enjoyed was the Brave and the Bold appearances. With the Jim Aparo, and I just thought they were beautifully done. The way he was portrayed, and again that kind of Jim Aparo look to him. Yeah, again that hyper masculine boxer thing. I thought they were beautiful. I always sat there waiting, man, I wish this guy would reappear, and then he did reappear in your extended run.
He was a great character.
Before we close out, Geoff, can you talk a bit about your relationship with really interested the way that your relationship with Richard Donner ultimately it led to his actual involvement in comic books. Can you speak a bit about that, mate?
You know what's funny is that, going back to the JSA, it's so interesting. He was born in 1930, right? So he remembers buying Action One. He'd tell me, I remember buying it off the stands.
Wow.
Like, that's so cool.
Yeah.
But he clearly loves Superman. Superman was a big love of his, and he knew some of the characters, but he didn't really talk about other comic book characters much. But I would always talk to him about Superman, and one of the reasons I sought a job with him because of Superman. Like, I remember I was working on JSA because I started writing comics about 2.5 years after I started working for him. And I remember one day, one of my issues of JSA showed up, early issue I worked on, and Alan Scott was on the cover, and he walked by. My desk was here. His office door was back there. He walked by my desk, and he looked down, and he saw Alan Scott. And, you know, almost anyone in the world would be like, who's that? He goes, Green Lantern. He didn't even think Golden Age Green Lantern,
He
because
just knew.
that was
Yeah.
Green Lantern when he was growing up. That was Green Lantern.
Yeah.
So he knew that. Like if I showed him probably Hal Jordan, he'd be like, "Who's that?" But he saw
Yeah.
Alan Scott and he said Green Lantern. So there was I remember thinking, that's so cool. Like his reference point is the JSA as a kid. Like, I mean, that was, I remember just a little stunned. But yeah, I worked for him for 4.5 years, in this very building, actually. And I started writing comics as I was working for him, and they would come, I get my little comps and I'd have Stars and Stripe there. And he was always excited about the comics coming in. But we would talk about not just superheroes, but heroes in general and stories and everything. And he had a lot of great, stories about Superman and all his movies. But I had the privilege to eat lunch with him and Christopher Reeve once. That was
Mate, come on, that's amazing.
It was amazing, and it was really a special. We drove up to Santa Barbara to meet him. He was up there for a conference, and Dick invited me to come. It was really pretty amazing. But yeah, I mean, Dick, he was like a second father. He was a mentor. He was an awesome guy. His legacy is huge. And when I started writing comics, eventually I had so much comic work. I'm like, I want to go write more. And so I left the company right when he moved off the lot. And I was working for a couple more years in comics. And then at some point, DC was talking to me about Superman, and I'm like, I wonder if Dick would ever want to like come up with a story together. And I thought like we could do something with General Zod because it's never been done. Like he really wasn't, although he's a giant character in the movies, they really didn't introduce him in the comics that much. Like he really wasn't, he wasn't in the comics a lot. So, which was odd, right? And so
he's almost like a supporting character in the comics. Like he's just a walk-on part, isn't he?
Yeah. And Nan and Ursa had never been in the comics, which I was like, how are they not in the comics? They're so great. And so went to Dick, and we started just talking about what the story could be if we brought him back. What would we do? And we came up with the storyline, and we would break it together, and I'd script it and he'd give me notes, and that's how it came about. But it was, I mean, that there's a magic to it, like to the movies. Whenever I'm gonna have to go in a second, unfortunately. Whenever he would go into the Daily Planet, that was the most fun you'd have with Jim Wilson, Lois Lane, and Perry. It was it should be the most boring time. He should be like, get back to Superman. But it was the most fun. And so whenever we would do that in the comics, I'd love writing those characters. I love being in that Daily Planet. Some of that, the dialogue just comes out from all of them because it's so inherently locked into our heads, those scenes. But anyway, that's, he was an amazing human being. The world is much less cool without him on it right now.
That's wonderful, mate, and a great place to close out on. So thank you very much for that, mate. That's been a wonderful hour-long chat, not just about your new and awesome Image Comics book with Gary Frank, Junkyard Joe, which I've got a bunch of great initiatives for veterans around its publication, and not just about your new Justice Society of America book, but about the entirety of your bits and pieces of your career. Thanks very much for joining me on Forbidden Planet TV, mate. It's really great to see you.
Thanks. Great to see you too. Talk to you soon. See ya.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.